When I was 9, my dad, Richard Hale, walked out the door and never came back. I still remember the slam of the front door, the echo of his boots on the porch, and my mom's trembling hands holding a crumpled note that said he was sorry, but he had to find happiness. That happiness, as we later learned, came in the form of another woman, a younger one, who had a son just a few years older than me. He left me, my mom, and my little brother with nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. Mom did everything she could to keep us afloat. She picked up double shifts at the diner, cleaned offices at night, and still came home to help us with homework. I watched her work herself into exhaustion just so we wouldn't starve. Meanwhile, my dad was out there starting a shiny new life, vacations, barbecues, smiles, and family photos that I sometimes came across online. The anger I carried wasn't loud, it was quiet, deep, and cold. It hardened inside me over the years, pushing me to do better, to prove that I didn't need him. I became obsessed with success, with building something so strong that no one could ever make me feel disposable again. In high school, while my friends were busy planning prom, I was studying business and finance. I graduated at the top of my class and earned a scholarship to a top university. I studied relentlessly, took on internships during summer breaks, and learned everything I could about leadership, company growth, and mergers. Every sleepless night was powered by a single image, my father smiling beside the son he chose instead of me. After college, I started working for a small but ambitious consulting firm in New York. I began as an analyst, but within a few years, I climbed the ranks. I was strategic, patient, and ruthless when I needed to be. My boss, a sharp but aging executive named Martin Lang, recognized my drive and mentored me. He once told me, "The best revenge isn't destruction, it's domination." I didn't realize how true that would become. By my early 30s, I had co-founded my own firm, Hale Strategies. The name was deliberate. It was my surname, but this time it stood for something on my terms. I wanted to rebuild what he had destroyed, but in a way that reminded me that the Hale name belonged to me now. We grew fast. I specialized in corporate turnarounds, stepping in to rescue struggling businesses and transform them into profit-making machines. My reputation spread quickly across the industry. That's how it happened, the day my father came back into my life without even realizing it. Our firm had just landed a contract with a mid-sized logistics company that was sinking in debt and mismanagement. The board reached out to us to take control and restructure the leadership team. I was reviewing the files when I saw the CEO's name, Richard Hale. For a moment, I froze. It couldn't be. I opened the personnel folder, and there it was. His face. Older, heavier, a little more worn, but unmistakably him. My father. The man who abandoned us. The man who'd left my mother to drown in debt while he started a new life with his real family. The anger that surged through me wasn't like before. It was calm, methodical, and laced with something dangerous, power. For the first time, I wasn't the child he'd left behind. I was the one in charge. I didn't tell anyone about the connection. When the restructuring began, I sat across from him in the first meeting. He didn't recognize me right away. I'd changed, sharper features, confident posture, tailored suit. He looked nervous, desperate to impress. "Mr. Hale," I said, extending my hand. "I'm Ava. Ava Hale." The name hit him like a bullet. His hand trembled as he shook mine. His eyes widened. "Ava," he stammered, almost whispering. I smiled coldly. "Yes. It's been a long time, hasn't it?" The silence that followed was thick enough to cut through. Every executive in the room looked confused. I could feel the heat of his shame radiating across the table. From that moment, the balance of power had shifted. Over the next few weeks, I ran the company through an intense audit. I uncovered shady deals, tax issues, and failed projects, all under his leadership. I didn't have to fabricate anything. His greed and negligence had done the work for me. He tried to speak with me privately several times. "Ava, please," he'd start. "I know you hate me, but you have to understand," I'd stop him each time. "We're not here to discuss the past, Mr. Hale. We're here to fix your mess." He grew smaller every day, both in stature and spirit. His once confident voice turned meek. I could see the realization dawning on him that his daughter, the one he left behind, now controlled his future. One evening, after another brutal board meeting, he came to my office. His eyes were red. I made mistakes, Ava. I was stupid. I thought I could have it all, and I lost everything. Please, don't take this away from me. This company is all I have left. I leaned back in my chair, studying him like a case file. You took everything from us, I said quietly. You didn't think twice about it. You walked out and never looked back. My mother cried herself to sleep for years. I raised my brother alone while you played Father of the Year somewhere else. And now you want mercy? He dropped his gaze, silent. I'm not that little girl anymore, I said. And you're not my father. You're just another man who thought he was untouchable. When the board voted to remove him as CEO 2 weeks later, I didn't stop them. I signed the final approval myself. He stood in the hallway afterward, watching as I walked into his old office, my office now. For months, he lingered, trying to find ways to reach out. I ignored every attempt. When I later learned he'd applied for a junior consulting role at a branch company we acquired, I allowed it. He didn't know it, but I signed off on his employment under another division. Now, years later, Richard Hale works quietly as a low-level consultant, while I run one of the most powerful business networks in the region. Sometimes I see his name on internal memos. I wonder if he realizes that every paycheck he cashes comes from the daughter he abandoned. But I never needed his apology. I already got what I wanted: control, respect, and peace. The day I reclaimed the Hale name wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. I became everything he wasn't: loyal, strong, and fearless. And every time someone says, Miss Hale, I remember that I didn't inherit that name. I rebuilt it from ashes. Some nights, when the city lights shimmer through my office window, I think about the past, the small house, the crying, the broken promises. Then I smile, pour myself a drink, and whisper to the memory of him, you thought leaving would make me weak. But all it did was make me unstoppable. That's the thing about abandonment. It can destroy you, or it can forge you into steel. And I chose steel. The weeks following his dismissal were strange. I had dreamed of this moment for years, the day I would finally see him crumble under the weight of his own failures. But when it actually happened, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like silence. Heavy, still, and almost too quiet to celebrate. I told myself that success was the real victory, not revenge. But at night, when I walked through my penthouse overlooking the skyline, I'd pour a glass of wine, sit by the window, and imagine him in his small rented apartment, staring at his own reflection. Did he finally see what he had done? Did he remember my mother's face when he left? Did he regret choosing comfort over character? I could have let him fade into obscurity, but life had other plans. 6 months after the takeover, the company he once led had transformed into something powerful and efficient. My leadership drew attention, and soon, larger corporations began reaching out for partnerships. Among them was Stellar Freight Solutions, a global logistics company, and coincidentally, the same firm where my half-brother, his golden child, worked as a senior operations manager. When the contract negotiations began, I saw the list of representatives scheduled to meet me. There it was again, Ethan Hale, my half-brother, the one who grew up with a father I never had, the one who got Christmases, family vacations, and bedtime stories while I learned to stretch a box of macaroni over 3 dinners. When he walked into my office for the first time, it was like staring into a distorted mirror. He had our father's jawline, the same sharp eyes, and the same confident smirk. But unlike Richard, he didn't recognize me right away. I introduced myself with a calm, professional smile. Ava Hale, CEO of Hale Strategies. His brow furrowed slightly. Hale? Any relation to Richard Hale? I took a measured sip of coffee. You could say that. Over the next few meetings, I kept things strictly business. Ethan was charming but careless, full of that unearned confidence that comes from never being told no. He treated the partnership like a game, showing off, making comments about young female executives as if I'd be impressed. He had no idea who he was dealing with. When the negotiations reached a crucial point, Stellar Freight made a mistake, a breach of confidentiality. I had grounds to void the deal entirely, but instead, I proposed something better, a merger. Under new terms, Hale Strategies would gain controlling interest in Stellar's North American branch. It would take months of paperwork and internal reshuffling, but I was patient. I had learned patience the hard way. When the merger finalized, Ethan called to congratulate me. "You really know how to play the long game, Ava," he said with a laugh. My dad always said the Hale name was built for leadership. I smiled into the phone. He wasn't wrong. It wasn't until the next quarter's review meeting that both of them, Ethan and Richard, ended up sitting across from me again. Richard had been quietly rehired by Stellar Freight as a strategic advisor. He probably thought he was getting his footing back in the industry. The boardroom was silent when I entered. My heels echoed against the marble floor as I took my seat at the head of the table. Richard looked pale. Ethan was confused, glancing between us. "Welcome, gentlemen," I said evenly. "As of today, Hale Strategies is the majority shareholder in this division. That means all operational decisions go through me." Ethan blinked. "Wait, you're the new owner?" "That's right," I said, sliding a folder across the table. "You'll find the updated hierarchy outlined there. Richard, you'll report directly to me from now on." The room went quiet. I watched the color drain from both their faces. Richard looked at me like a man haunted by his past. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand to stop him. "Before we move forward," I continued, "there's something you should both understand. You built your careers on my mother's tears, on my childhood struggles, on the belief that I was forgettable. But I don't forget. I build." Ethan tried to laugh it off. "This is crazy." "You can't, I can," I interrupted softly. And I did. From that day forward, I made them both answer to me. I didn't humiliate them in public. That would have been too easy. Instead, I buried them under professionalism so sharp it cut deeper than any insult. Richard was assigned to low-level strategy work, late hours, endless reports, and constant oversight. Ethan was stripped of his managerial authority, placed under a strict performance review system that left him scrambling to keep up. Behind the glass walls of my office, I watched them both crumble slowly. The once proud father who had abandoned his family now signed off reports for the daughter he'd left behind. The son he'd chosen over me now worked double hours to prove himself and failed miserably. Months later, I found Richard sitting alone in the break room after hours. He looked old, defeated. His hands trembled as he held a paper cup of cold coffee. When he saw me, he stood quickly. "Ava, please. Can we talk? Just for a minute." I hesitated, then nodded. He took a deep breath. You've done well. I always knew you would. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just need you to know I think about what I did every day. Leaving your mother, leaving you. It was the biggest mistake of my life." I studied him for a long moment. For years, I'd imagined this conversation, how I'd yell, or walk away, or say something cutting. But now, seeing him so small, I realized something profound. I didn't need his apology anymore. "I believe you," I said finally. "But that doesn't change anything." He nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "I understand." I turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You wanted happiness, remember? You found it once. I hope you find peace now." That was the last real conversation we ever had. Over the next few years, I grew Hale Strategies into an empire. We expanded internationally, acquired new sectors, and became a case study in modern leadership. Every magazine profile, every award, every headline carried the same name, Ava Hale, and every time I saw it in print, I thought of how far I'd come from that scared little girl standing in the doorway watching her father drive away. One winter evening, as I left the office, I saw him again, standing on the sidewalk, bundled in a worn coat. He didn't try to stop me this time. He just watched me walk past, his eyes full of pride and regret. For a fleeting second, I almost turned back. But then I remembered the years of silence, the pain my mother endured, the nights I cried myself to sleep wondering what I'd done wrong. So I kept walking. When I reached my car, I glanced in the reflection of the window. Behind me, he was gone, swallowed by the city lights. I smiled faintly and whispered to myself, that's what power feels like, not cruelty, but control. The kind that comes from surviving what was meant to destroy you. And that night, as I drove home to the life I built from nothing, I realized something even deeper. Revenge wasn't about making them suffer. It was about proving that I could rise, not in spite of them, but because of them. Because sometimes the people who abandon you don't realize they're the ones building your fire. And when you rise, you burn bright enough for them to see what they lost. A few months passed, and the world continued to move around me fast, bright, demanding. My company was thriving. Investors lined up. The media called me a visionary. People wanted to hear my story, the self-made CEO who redefined resilience. Every time I stepped on a stage to speak, I saw flashes from cameras, microphones angled toward me, voices asking how I overcame adversity. They wanted the glossy version, the rise, not the pain. They wanted the lesson, not the scars. Sometimes, standing under the spotlights, I'd remember being that little girl in a second-hand coat, waiting on the front porch for a father who never came back. The memory was like an echo, distant but sharp enough to pierce through the applause. After one of those events, I visited my mother. She still lived in the same small house, though I'd offered to move her somewhere new 100 times. She said the old walls held memories she wasn't ready to let go of. When I walked in, she was tending to her garden, wearing a sun hat and humming softly. She looked peaceful, lines of age, yes, but also of strength. Busy week? She asked with a knowing smile. I nodded and hugged her. The usual. Investors, interviews, paperwork. You know how it is. She chuckled. You always were chasing something, even as a child. Always building something in your head. I smiled faintly. Maybe I just wanted to build something no one could take away. She looked at me then, her eyes soft but heavy with understanding. You did that, Ava. You built more than a company. You built yourself. We sat together on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in amber and rose. After a while, she said quietly, I heard your father isn't doing well. A neighbor mentioned he moved back to the city. I felt a flicker in my chest, not guilt, not quite pity, something in between. I know, I said. I saw him outside the office once. She hesitated. Did you talk? I shook my head. There wasn't anything left to say. She reached over and took my hand. You don't have to carry him anymore, Ava. You already won. The words settled deep inside me. Maybe winning wasn't about payback or control. Maybe it was about letting go without needing to forget. That night, I drove back through the city. The skyline shimmered, tall glass towers reaching into the stars. Somewhere in that maze of lights, I knew he was there, living a small, quiet life, watching the empire he abandoned flourish under my name. Sometimes, when I passed the building where he used to work, I saw him standing across the street, almost like a ghost haunting his own past. He never approached. He just watched from a distance, proud and broken all at once. Once, after a long meeting, I came down to the lobby and saw him waiting. My assistant froze, unsure what to do. I nodded for her to leave us alone. He looked thinner, older. The confident man who had once commanded rooms now looked like he was afraid to take up space. Hi, he said softly. Hi, I replied, my voice calm. He fumbled with his hat, nervous. You look happy. I'm glad. Thank you, I said simply. He swallowed. I wanted to tell you something. You don't have to listen, but I need to say it. I folded my arms. Go ahead. He took a deep breath. When I left, I thought I was doing what was best for me, what I deserved. I told myself I could build a better life. But all I did was destroy the only real thing I ever had. You and your mother deserved better. And you got it, without me. I see that now. He looked down at the floor, his voice trembling. You were the best part of me, Ava. I just didn't see it until it was too late. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't cry. The anger that had once consumed me was gone. In its place was something gentler, like grief softened by time. Maybe it's not too late to start being honest, I said. But I can't rebuild something that never had a foundation. He nodded slowly. I understand. As he turned to leave, I said quietly, I forgive you. He stopped, stunned. Not because you earned it, I continued, but because I need peace more than I need revenge. He blinked, his eyes glistening. Thank you, he whispered. And then he was gone. When I stepped outside that evening, the city air felt lighter. For the first time in years, I didn't feel chained to my past. I wasn't defined by what he did, I was defined by what I became. Months later, at a leadership conference, I was asked a question during a Candace session. What drives you? I paused for a long time, looking out at the audience. Then I smiled. What drives me, I said, is the belief that pain can be recycled into power. That what breaks you can also build you if you let it. The crowd applauded, but I wasn't thinking of them. I was thinking of my mother sitting in her garden, of the little girl I once was, of the man who walked away and the woman who learned to walk on her own. I wasn't that abandoned daughter anymore. I was Ava Hale, CEO, leader, survivor. And my story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rebirth. Still, there was satisfaction in knowing that every time my name appeared on a building, a magazine, or a boardroom plaque, it carried the legacy he tried to erase. My father had left to build a better life, but in the end, I built the one he always dreamed of. And that was the ultimate victory. As I left the stage that day, the applause still ringing, I thought about something my mother used to say when things were hard. Sometimes the people who walk out of your life are just making room for the person you're meant to become. And she was right. Because the day he left wasn't the day my life fell apart, it was the day it began. Years passed like seasons shifting, one blending quietly into the next. The company grew beyond anything I had ever imagined. We had offices in New York, Chicago, Seattle, even London. Every decision I made was guided by the lessons I'd learned the hard way. Loyalty mattered more than ambition, integrity more than appearance, and silence. Sometimes silence was the loudest form of power. My father's face faded from the public eye. After that last meeting in the lobby, I never saw him again. There were whispers that he'd moved to a small coastal town, that he'd stopped working altogether, that he lived alone. I didn't look for him. I didn't need to. The version of him I had loved was gone long ago, buried under his own choices. Still, on quiet nights, I sometimes wondered if he thought of me, if he ever realized that the empire he'd built his ego around had now become the empire I ruled. Not because I stole it from him, but because I earned every inch of it. One day, years later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name written in shaky cursive. Inside was a single page. Ava, I'm proud of you. I don't deserve to say it, but I needed you to know. I see you in every headline, every interview. You became everything I never had the courage to be. Dad. There was no apology, no plea for forgiveness. Just quiet acknowledgement. And that was enough. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. That night, I didn't cry. I just sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, and let the sound of the rain wash away the last of the resentment that had once lived inside me. Time softened the edges of everything, even the pain. When my mother passed away, it was gentle, peaceful, like a candle quietly burning out after lighting the whole room. At her funeral, I stood in front of the small crowd and spoke through trembling lips. My mother was the strongest person I've ever known, I said. She taught me that broken things can still bloom. That even when life takes everything, you can still find the courage to start again. After the service, I walked to the small lake behind the cemetery. The air was still. The water mirrored the sky perfectly, blue fading into silver. I pulled out the letter from my father that I had carried in my purse for years. I forgive you both, I whispered, my voice carried away by the wind. Then I let the letter go. It floated for a moment, then sank beneath the surface, swallowed by stillness. That night, I returned home and sat in my office overlooking the city, my city. The skyline sparkled, a living reflection of every sleepless night, every tear shed, every battle won. I thought about the girl I once was, small, scared, clinging to a photo of her father like a lifeline. I wished I could tell her that she'd make it, that she'd not only survive, but rise higher than she could ever dream. I closed my eyes and imagined that girl walking beside me now, no longer afraid, her hand slipping into mine. I did it, I whispered to her. We did it. The sound of the city below was alive, horns, laughter, footsteps, all merging into a kind of rhythm that pulsed with energy, resilience, and rebirth. A few months later, I decided to start a foundation, the Hale Initiative, dedicated to helping single mothers and abandoned children get education and support. It wasn't just charity, it was closure. I wanted to build something that gave back what I never had: stability, belief, a second chance. On the opening day of the foundation, the press was there, cameras flashing, reporters asking questions. I gave a short speech. I grew up believing that being left behind meant I was unworthy, I said, my voice steady. But what I learned is that sometimes the people who leave are simply making room for your own strength to grow. This foundation is for the children who were told they weren't enough. You are enough. You always were. The applause echoed, but my focus drifted to the crowd: parents, kids, volunteers, faces full of hope. And I realized that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been broken and rebuilt. That night, after everyone had gone, I walked alone through the empty halls of my company's headquarters. The glass walls reflected my silhouette, stronger, sharper, untouchable. At the top floor, I stopped by a framed photo, my first office, years ago, when it was just me and two employees who believed in me before I believed in myself. I smiled at the memory. And then, for reasons I couldn't explain, I whispered, "Thank you, Dad." Not out of love, not out of nostalgia, but gratitude, because without his betrayal, I might never have found this version of myself. Weeks later, an article appeared in a small local paper about a man named Thomas Hale, my father, who had passed away quietly in his sleep. No family mentioned. No grand legacy. Just a short obituary noting that he once worked in finance. I read it in silence. Then I placed the paper on my desk, stared out at the skyline, and said softly, "Rest easy." There was no anger left, no satisfaction, only peace. I walked to the window and pressed my hand against the glass, watching the reflection of the city lights blur against the night sky. My reflection looked back, confident, composed, free. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the abandoned daughter or the hurt child. I felt like the woman who had rewritten her story. As the wind brushed against the glass, I thought of my mother's voice again, her laughter, her strength, her unwavering belief that life gives back what you dare to create. And in that moment, I finally understood what she meant. Because I hadn't just taken control of my father's company. I had taken control of my own destiny. I had built something that outlived the pain, something rooted in purpose, resilience, and love. When I turned off the office lights and walked out that night, I didn't look back. The city stretched out before me, vast, alive, endless, and for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The story of abandonment had become a story of power. The story of betrayal had turned into one of rebirth. And I, Ava Hale, the girl who was once forgotten, had become unforgettable. After my father's obituary appeared in that small-town newspaper, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't grief that haunted me, it was the silence. The kind that lingers between two people who once meant everything to each other but never found their way back. I hadn't attended his funeral. I couldn't. Not because I hated him anymore, but because I had already said goodbye years ago, in that letter I let sink beneath the lake's still surface. But still, some part of me needed to see where he had spent his final days. Maybe to make peace. Maybe to understand. A month later, I drove out to the coastal town mentioned in the article, a quiet, windswept place where the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. His small rented house sat near the cliff, overlooking the waves. The landlord, an older woman with kind eyes, recognized me from the news. "You must be Ava," she said softly. "He spoke about you sometimes." I froze. "He did." She nodded. "Not much, but when he did, he always looked out at the sea. Said he used to have a daughter who was smarter than him. Said she ran a company now as something about finance or investments." My throat tightened. "He told you that?" "Yes," she said, smiling faintly. "He said he'd messed up more than most fathers ever could. But he hoped you'd never hate him as much as he hated himself." The words cut deeper than I expected. I thanked her quietly and asked if I could see his room. Inside, everything was simple: a small bed, a desk with scattered notebooks, a shelf lined with cheap paperbacks. On the desk sat a photo frame turned face down. I hesitated before flipping it over. It was a picture of me, maybe 10 years old, missing a front tooth, grinning with my arm around him at the fair. I remembered that day vividly. It was one of the last times he looked at me like I was his whole world. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the photo. My eyes blurred, but I didn't cry. Not the way I used to. The ache had changed over the years, softer, duller, but still there, like an old scar that twinges when it rains. I noticed a stack of letters on the table, addressed, but never sent. They were all to me. I sat down and began reading. Ava, I saw you in Forbes today. I don't think you'll ever read this, but you looked happy. I hope you are. I hope you're everything I wasn't brave enough to become. Ava, I tried to call your mother once, but she didn't pick up. I don't blame her. If I could undo it all, I would. But I suppose that's not how time works. Ava, I heard you started something called the Hale Initiative. You made our name mean something good. That's more than I ever did. I'm proud of you. There were 27 letters in total, written over years. Some long, some just a few words. None ever sent. I sat there until the sun went down, the ocean whispering outside the window. For the first time in my life, I realized something. Maybe my father's punishment wasn't losing me. Maybe it was living long enough to know exactly what he'd lost. When I left that house, I didn't take any of his belongings except for one letter, the first one he wrote. I kept it in my office drawer, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of closure. Back in the city, my company was preparing for a massive merger, a deal that would make us one of the most powerful firms in North America. My team buzzed with energy, the air electric with anticipation. But I carried myself differently now. Calmer. Lighter. One evening, during a board meeting, a young woman named Grace, one of our junior analysts, gave an impressive presentation. She reminded me so much of myself at that age, driven, sharp, full of potential but afraid to take up space. After the meeting, I called her into my office. You did incredible work today, I said. She blinked in surprise. Thank you, Ms. Hale. That means a lot. I smiled. You know, when I was your age, I didn't have anyone to tell me that I was good enough. So let me be that person for you now. Her eyes shimmered. I won't let you down. I nodded. Don't do it for me. Do it for yourself. As she left, I looked at the skyline again. It struck me that success wasn't about winning against someone, not even against the ghosts of your past. It was about becoming someone who didn't need revenge anymore. Someone who could turn pain into progress. A few months later, I was invited to a national leadership conference. During my speech, I told a story, not about numbers or strategy, but about survival. When I was 16, my father left us. For a long time, I thought that meant I wasn't enough. But what I learned is this: people leaving doesn't mean you're unworthy. Sometimes it just means they weren't strong enough to stay. And that's not your failure. It's theirs. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. I spent years chasing validation from ghosts, I continued. Then one day, I stopped running. I built something with the pain they gave me. And that is my revenge. The room erupted in applause. But all I felt was stillness. Because in that moment, I knew I had finally closed the chapter. Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I stepped onto the balcony. The city below sparkled like a sea of stars. I pulled out my phone and looked at the company's motto on our website: from loss comes legacy. It felt right. It felt true. I thought about my mother, how she used to hum softly while making coffee, her tired eyes still warm with love. I thought about my father, broken, regretful, yet human. And then I thought about the girl I once was, standing at that bus stop years ago, clutching a suitcase and a heart full of hurt. She'd made it. We'd made it. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You're safe now." The breeze carried the words into the night. That's when I realized revenge wasn't just about taking back power. Sometimes it was about reclaiming peace. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains, golden and quiet. I smiled for no reason at all. The world outside felt different, softer, kinder, maybe because I finally was too. My story didn't end with anger or revenge. It ended with freedom. And as I walked into another busy day, ready to lead meetings, sign contracts, and chase dreams, I carried one truth with me. I had turned abandonment into empire and pain into purpose. I didn't just survive him. I surpassed him. I became everything he wasn't brave enough to be. And that, I realized, was the sweetest victory of all. The months after visiting my father's seaside home passed quietly, but something inside me had shifted. The anger that once burned so fiercely was now a fading ember, warm enough to remember, but not enough to destroy me. I still ran Hale Financial with precision and ambition, but I began seeing the people behind the numbers. My employees weren't just workers, they were stories, people with struggles, families, and dreams. Perhaps that was why I started something new, a mentorship program for young women from broken homes. I called it Rise Again. We gave scholarships, career guidance, therapy support, everything I once wished someone had given me when I was 16 and terrified of the world. It became the most fulfilling part of my life. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, my assistant buzzed me. "There's someone here to see you," she said, hesitantly. "He says he knew your father." I frowned. "Send him in." A tall, older man walked in, late 60s maybe, wearing a weathered suit and carrying a leather briefcase that had clearly seen better days. His voice was soft when he spoke. "My name is Thomas. I worked with your father at the docks before he passed." I gestured for him to sit. "What can I do for you, Mr. Thomas?" He placed a small envelope on my desk. "He asked me to give you this if I ever found you. He didn't have much, but he said you'd understand." I opened the envelope and found a folded piece of paper and a silver bracelet. The note read, "For the daughter who became the woman I never had the courage to raise. You didn't just build a company, Ava, you rebuilt our name. This bracelet was your mother's. I never deserved to hold on to it, but maybe it'll remind you of who you are and that I never stopped being proud of you." The handwriting trembled, uneven and shaky. I held the bracelet carefully. It was simple, with small engraved initials, H. For a long time, I just sat there in silence. There was no bitterness anymore. Just the quiet ache of what could have been, and the peace of finally knowing he hadn't forgotten me. Later that evening, I walked to the city's waterfront. The skyline shimmered across the water like liquid gold. I unclasped the bracelet, kissed it gently, and let it slip into the tide. "Goodbye, Dad," I whispered. "I forgive you." The waves carried it away, as though the ocean itself had been waiting for the moment I finally let go. When I returned home, my mother was sitting in the living room, reading one of her old romance novels. Her hair had gone gray, but her eyes, those same soft eyes that had once cried over empty promises, still held the same strength. "You went to see him, didn't you?" she asked without looking up. I nodded. "He's gone now." She closed her book gently. "I know." We sat together in silence. For once, there was no resentment between us, just a shared understanding. "You did good, Ava," she said finally, turning to look at me. "You became everything I hoped you'd be." I smiled faintly. "You raised me to survive, Mom." "He just taught me how strong I could be." Her eyes glistened. "That's my girl." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. For years, I'd thought revenge meant making him regret ever leaving us. But now I realized true revenge was living a life so full, so successful, that his absence didn't define me anymore. The next morning, I got a call from the governor's office. My foundation had been nominated for a National Humanitarian Award. I couldn't help but laugh softly. Life had a strange way of turning pain into purpose. During the award ceremony, as I stood on stage holding the glass trophy, flashes of cameras surrounded me. But in my mind, I wasn't in that ballroom. I was back on that bus years ago, a scared teenage girl clutching her suitcase. "You made it," I whispered under my breath. When the applause died down, I gave my speech. "I once thought success was about proving people wrong," I began, voice steady. "But it's not. It's about proving to yourself that you're more than what happened to you. To every person who's ever been abandoned, betrayed, or told they'd never make it, you can build something from the ashes. You can rise again." The audience stood. Cameras flashed. My mother wiped her eyes in the front row. Later that night, as I drove home, the city lights blurred outside the car window. I thought about how life had come full circle. The man who had once abandoned us ended up becoming the ghost who fueled my rise. I didn't just take back control. I rewrote the story. And when people asked me later what I would say to my father if I could speak to him one last time, I always gave the same answer. I'd tell him thank you. Not out of forgiveness, but out of recognition, because his betrayal had built my backbone. His absence had carved my strength. Years later, when I retired from Hale Financial, I sat in my office one last time. The walls were lined with plaques, awards, photos of smiling teams, and charity events. But one frame stood out, the photo of that little girl at the fair with her dad. I kept it there, not to mourn, but to remember how far I'd come. As I turned off the lights and walked out of the building for the final time, the receptionist, a young man with bright eyes, smiled at me. "Congratulations, Miss Hale. You've built quite the legacy." I paused and smiled softly. "No," I said. "We did." And as I stepped into the sunlight, I knew that was true. My story was never just about revenge. It was about transformation. The kind that only comes from surviving heartbreak and choosing to rise higher anyway. I'd once been the daughter he left behind. Now, I was the woman the world remembered. And as I got into my car and drove away, the city skyline gleaming ahead, I whispered one final truth to myself. Some people break you to test your strength. But some of us, we rebuild into something unbreakable. The wind outside carried my words into the sky, quiet, powerful, eternal. And just like that, my story ended not in rage, but in peace and the sweetest revenge of all, living well, thriving louder, and forgiving silently.